Good morning, everyone. I've got someone trolling me in the comments already, and it's my co-host Mike Niziolek. This is Mind Your Banners for Friday, October 11th, 2024. I hope you're happy with yourself. He is Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. We'll see how this goes. We've done some live stuff before, primarily I think live post-game reaction shows for football. Not every podcast will be live, but we'll probably start doing these more often. If people want to get involved in the comments, that is more than welcome. I think today we are going to take stock of Indiana football at the halfway point. Mike, obviously, we spent Monday talking primarily about media day takeaways. We said we'd probably get together later in the week to focus more on football. Has it been a good bye week for you?
It's been fine.
What's that mean? You just
it has been fine. That's how I would define it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad it's been fine. It is the first of two bye weeks for Indiana this season. It's an unusually sort of expanded calendar. Comes at a good time. Indiana's played 6 games, won all 6. Obviously, not maybe with the result a lot of experts were expecting. One impressively, certainly, you look at where Indiana is in the national rankings. You look at where Indiana is in sort of the analytics and different things like that. Clearly, there are not a lot of people that think that Indiana is not, I guess, quote unquote, for real. I suppose would be the best way to put that. But I do think, Mike, it's fair to say everyone is anticipating Indiana's second half of the schedule because I think we will learn a lot more about this team over the last 6 games after sort of the first 6 games, ultimately, because Indiana played so well, turned into such a sort of scene setter for this group.
Was there a question in there?
No, I was leading you in.
Leading me in? Yeah, I mean, what we've talked about, that look, they set themselves up to possibly be in the Big Ten title game, to be a contender for the college football playoff. I mean, what more can you ask from a team, in their first year with a head coach? And I think everything's in front of them, and the competition level ranks up. But should be an interesting 7 weeks here.
Yeah, 7 weeks. Is it 7 weeks till glory? 7 weeks till history? What are we calling this stretch?
I don't know if it has a nickname.
7 weeks till the end of the season. So through the first 6 games, I mean, we'll rehash some of this. Obviously, I think Indiana fans are pretty well familiar with it at this point. Indiana's undefeated. Indiana has not won a game by fewer than 2 touchdowns. Indiana has not trailed yet this season. Indiana, I think, is 18th and 20th in the 2 national rankings. If you look at the FPI, Indiana is I had them here, and then I lost them. Indiana's 14th in the Football Power Index, which is ESPN's, kind of analytics. They have obviously shot up a lot of the other sort of charts and things, S&P Plus, stuff like that. The FPI projections right now have Indiana going 10-2. And they give the Hoosiers actually a 51.9% chance. So essentially a coin toss chance of making the college football playoff. I think there have been some really strong individual performers. I think Curtis Rourke deserves a lot of credit, obviously. I did a sort of a mini tweet thread about this yesterday or the day before. I can't remember which, but I think we're probably underappreciating how good Indiana's running back rotation has been, which by extension is a way of saying we're underappreciating how good Indiana's offensive line has been. But this is a team that, particularly offensively, has an argument as the best in the country. And I don't know that it is the best offense in the country, bar none. I think it's almost certainly the best offense in the Big Ten through these first 6 games. But that's the kind of company you're keeping. And we can talk a little bit about reframing expectations. But Indiana offensively in particular has put itself kind of in the room with the nation's absolute best, and it's been impressive to see.
Well, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned Roy, and I think he's obviously MVP through first 6 weeks, especially in the offense. But who's your non-Rourke offensive MVP through first 6 weeks?
I feel like I'd probably have to split between Justice Ellison and Tyson Lawton. And I've gone to bat for Elijah Surratt. I think he's had a really good season. But Indiana has something like 7 more rushing touchdowns than any other team in the conference. And, I think that entire sort of dynamic has flown a little bit under the radar because Indiana splits those carries up. They don't seem to want to have. I mean, by Curt Cignetti's own sort of description of how he handles the running back situation, I'm not sure they want to have that one bell cow back that is getting, 30, 33 carries or 35 touches a game or whatever. But like if you take those top 3, and this is even removing Elijah Green, who when he's been given kind of the opportunity has been pretty explosive, from that running back spot. But if you take those kind of established top 3 of Lawton, Ellison, and Black, and you blend their numbers together, you basically get a running back or at least a backfield that's as good as any in the Big Ten. And that's, again, I think this also goes back to we probably need to put a little bit more respect on the offensive line. And in fairness, I think you and I both in different ways said last season we felt Indiana's offensive line showed improvement. It just didn't lead ultimately to making the kinds of plays that was winning Indiana enough football games. Now it feels like you've got an offensive line that's taken another step forward with better play calling behind it, leading to more explosive plays, better third down conversions. Sarcastic Mike OTF posted in the comments, Indiana's first team offense has scored in every single time in the red zone that it has tried. And that is true with, I think, one exception, but Indiana's only 3 failed red zone possessions were all basically in garbage time. So the point is, I lean to those 2 running backs because between them, they have given Indiana a balance and they've kept Indiana on schedule and they've helped Indiana finish in the red zone in ways that have been really impressive, in ways that, frankly, this program was really missing the last 2 or 3 years.
That's not the right answer. Surratt was the right answer. Well, no, but particularly, I think down the stretch in the last 2 games, he's sort of taken over. His toughness, I think you've mentioned a couple of times. I don't know, it's been sort of a defining. I think has lifted this team. Last 2 games, he has had 7 receptions, over 125 yards. And it's been dominant. I think the rushing offense has been better than I think we thought. I think it's been as good as what the coaches thought, but I think their numbers are sort of really inflated from the non-conference portion of the schedule. And if you look kind of in the Big Ten against Big Ten opponents, it's much more average. And not to say it's been bad in the conference, averaging less than 4 yards per carry. Just the 7 touchdowns versus non-conference, they averaging over 6 yards a carry with 16 touchdowns. But I think the red zone performance has been really strong across the board from them, and that's sort of I think what stands out. But I think with this receiving group, I think it's been sort of one of the bright spots of the entire team, and I think Surratt's sort of leading the way. And I don't think you can kind of ignore the fact that when they've needed a hard catch in the Big Ten, it's gone towards him.
And, I mean, you brought up his physicality. I think that's been important, too. I don't think it was like it wasn't going to be a surprise to me if Indiana was going to be able to pass the ball well this year between the staff's background, Rourke's resume, just the sheer tonnage of talent. And I wouldn't have expected, for example, Donovan McCulley to not even really crack the rotation, but
he did have a touchdown.
He had the one, but you looked at that receiver room, and at least in bulk, you felt like there were enough pieces there. I just didn't expect Indiana, and I take your point about conference-only numbers. I just didn't expect Indiana to be quite as productive on the ground, and I think in particular, it has made a difference for this team in the two areas that I think that if we're talking, about statistical differences between last year and this year, I think two of the big ones for me, and I've hammered this for a few weeks now, third downs and red zone situations. And those running backs have been crucial in both of those. Now, Curtis Rourke has been probably the most important piece actually in both those situations. Rourke has 10 touchdown passes in the red zone, which is an impressive number. It's usually supposed to get harder for quarterbacks in the red zone. He hasn't really slowed down there. And obviously Rourke has been really good both at keeping Indiana on schedule, so third downs are manageable. And then, there have been times like the UCLA game where he's just outstanding on third downs of his own right. But you were asking me for my non-Rourke offensive MVP, and so that's where I've been to.
Similar question on the defense. Who's the non-Mikel Kamara defensive MVP award?
This gets into maybe an interesting conversation about one of the few negatives of the first 6 weeks. Is I'm not sure it's not Jalen Walker, and Aiden Fisher's been more productive statistically, and Fisher's definitely in that conversation. And obviously, Fisher also has the added element of being
the green dot,
the guy with the headset in his ears, but Walker is the one, and I thought it was actually somewhat pronounced the way Indiana, kind of struggled at least briefly. And I thought they made some good adjustments late third and in the fourth quarter, but Indiana looked less capable defensively without Jalen Walker on the field at Northwestern because they can ask him to do so many different things. They can line him up in coverage in the slot. They can obviously play him heavy against the run. It was a non-conference game, but I think there was a point where they even stretched him out to the boundary against somebody. I think Walker is such an athletic and versatile defender that I thought it was noticeable when he wasn't on the field anymore against Northwestern, and I think that it is going to be interesting to see what Indiana's worked on if he's not healthy coming out of the bye week. Curt Cignetti really didn't give us an update after the Northwestern game. I don't expect he'll give us one on Monday when we talk to him next on Jalen Walker. I guess it was like an arm or a shoulder. It looked like it was what happened. I will be very interested to see what this defense tries to do to compensate for not having him on the field if he can't play against Nebraska.
Yeah, I mean, they talked up, and Mikel Kamara talked up kind of his toughness that a couple times last year or in the last 2 years he's been kind of counted out with injuries, and Cignetti mentioned that as well, and didn't end up missing much time. But yeah, it looked like an upper body injury. Wasn't moving his arm as he left the field, and we'll kind of see. That would be the first major injury to a starter since Nick Kidwell in the preseason. So, I mean, that's some adversity, they'll face here maybe coming up next week. Isaiah Jones stepped in to the sort of starting lineup, and then they went to some three linebacker sets with Hardy coming in off the bench as well. Yeah, I mean, he's a good choice. I think, Aiden Fisher is probably just the easier one just because of I think his leadership, like you mentioned, he is the guy that kind of is responsible for all the communication in the back end.
He's also leading the Big Ten in tackles.
So yeah, one of the national, I think top 10 in the nation, too, in the category. So, I mean, just been very productive. Has rushed the quarterback well when he's needed to, has 11 quarterback pressures. Done pretty good in coverage in terms of not allowing, any busts back there and sort of covering a lot of ground like Walker. But I don't think either choice is a wrong answer like the one you had on offense.
I do think the other thing about Walker's potential injury is it is a bit of a reminder that there's still some spots in this team, and Indiana's been relatively fortunate with injuries. And I know there's things you can do to prevent them, and there's ways you can manage guys' bodies and what you do in practice and stuff to keep guys from wearing down. But there's also just times when you just suffer bad luck. Something gets twisted the wrong way, you land wrong, whatever. I also think Walker's injury, if it does endure beyond the second half of the Northwestern game, and that's one where the bye may be well timed, but if it's not, or if it's not enough, it's a reminder that there are still some spots on this team where Indiana doesn't have a lot of depth. And, I think we've seen maybe that defensive tackle rotation get a little deeper than we expected. I guess I'm not sure if the defensive end rotation isn't deep or if they've just chosen, if they just don't feel like they need to rotate that much right now. Like if somebody got hurt,
it's not a rotation. When you talk about in terms of they played about 330 snaps on defense, in sort of just looking at the PFF snap numbers. And Kamara's played 310 or 313, and Linnell Carr's played 274. So, it's not really a rotation. It's those two guys and get that.
Or just like if they had to go to someone like Jacob Mangum-Farrar, I wouldn't necessarily sit here and say I can guarantee you that's going to be a huge drop off. The way that I'd look at
they've done more of, to be honest, they've put rotated in like Burris at tackle and had him kind of be out to the edge, and even rotated Carpenter out to the edge and put Kamara at tackle. They've done more of that than Mangum-Farrar's only played shockingly 23 snaps this season.
Yeah, no, they have stayed relatively tight on that in group, but the difference is, I look at as promising as he's looked in moments. If Elijah Hardy is your backstop to Jalen Walker being out for a while, and because they've played Isaiah Jones a decent amount, even as kind of a third backer. They rotated him in a fair bit. Obviously, when
he's their 4-3 guy.
He's their 4-3 guy. If Walker's out, you imagine that means Jones starts, but then that means Hardy is probably seeing some, a meaningful number of snaps off the bench. If that's kind of your backstop against one of your top two linebackers getting hurt, he's a true freshman. Again, I think he's looked good at times, but not a lot of true freshmen are ready in a position like that where, I'm not sure there's a position in the defense where you have to blend physicality and athleticism with your ability to think your way through a game play to play the way you do at linebacker. There's so much to read, there's so much to communicate. You can at any given time you can literally be asked to do basically anything in a way that kind of nobody else has to embrace at the same time. Anyway, my point is just I think that
you lost it.
No, I didn't. No, my point is just that I think if you are looking at a longer term, let's say more than 2 to 3 weeks without Jalen Walker, at the same time that your schedule starts to get tougher, I do think that's where I remember we said in the preseason we thought Indiana might have to win some shootouts. We thought Indiana might have to win some games, 35-31, 45-35, something like that. So far this season, Indiana hasn't allowed more than 28 points in a game. That's a pretty good number. If you're having to live without Walker, that you might have to get more into that kind of offense wins you games for a little while.
On the since you kind of talk about some of the opponents, one thing I written down was obviously Ohio State looms large. I think that's easily, obviously, the hardest game on the schedule. But what do you rank sort of as the next? What game are you most interested to see how Indiana plays, or what's the next hardest opponent? What
the next hardest opponent? But the one that I would circle is Nebraska. Number one, Nebraska is better defensively than I think people realize. They've played some better teams, frankly, than Indiana has offensively. And they haven't won every one of those games, let's be clear. But they have played, some better teams. And they are, if you look at, I'm pulling up their conference stats right now. If you look at scoring defense, They're allowing 11.3 points per game. Rushing defense, they're top 5. So is Indiana, to be clear. I'm not trying to knock on Indiana. They've been a little bit more modest against the pass, but they're still allowing fewer than 200 total passing yards. They were firing some statistic around, and I forget what exactly it was, and some people kind of debunked it, but basically it was about how many sacks and tackles for loss they have. They lead the conference in both numbers. And they are, if you look at turnover margin, they are one of only 4 teams in the conference to have gained double-digit turnovers, to have forced 10 or more turnovers through these first 6 games. So my point is that team is very real on defense. Now, I think the flip side is it's a little bit more limited offensively. I think their passing game can kind of come and go a little bit. You are dealing with a freshman quarterback. I think if I'm not mistaken, they've had some injury issues along their offensive line. They've had to win some games, that I think people point to, for example, the way they had to win that Purdue game. And obviously that's a Purdue team that has just kind of been giving up points for fun against anybody else, at like Power 4 level that it's been playing. They beat Rutgers in a very defensive game, 14-7. But that to me is, absent maybe Ohio State and I guess possibly Michigan, the best defense Indiana's going to see the rest of this season. And I bring that up because, for better or worse, what I think wins, if Indiana winds up shooting the moon this season, let's say 10 or more wins, at very least in the playoff conversation, go into a high-level bowl, winds up with something that we would comfortably describe as the best season in program history. If Indiana pulls that off, then I think we can all recognize it's probably offense that's going to drive that particular car. Indiana's been good defensively, but Indiana has been great offensively. And frankly, especially for this program, is setting a pace that is generationally great offensively. And if Indiana can go out against Nebraska and play the way on offense that it's been playing against Northwestern and Maryland and UCLA, then that's when I start to think, okay, this team might be able to score enough points to beat basically anyone left on its schedule. Maybe not Ohio State, and that game's also in Columbus, so that dynamic's a little bit different too. And listen, I know that Ohio State, Indiana probably isn't always the best atmosphere in Columbus. If Indiana shows up ranked in the top 15 and in the running with Ohio State for Big Ten, for Big Ten title, trust me, you'll get Ohio Stadium in full voice. But if you can beat this Nebraska team, and especially if you can do it, I'm not saying you have to blow them away, but especially if you can do it, like let's say, for example, Indiana basically plays the same game against Nebraska and gets roughly the same result that it did against Northwestern, then that's when I think you start wondering if Indiana can go 11-1, because that's going to be, other than probably Ohio State and maybe Michigan, the best defense this team's going to play the rest of the year. And if Nebraska can't slow Indiana down coming off a bye week, yes, Indiana's going to have time to game plan, but so is Nebraska. If that Nebraska team cannot slow Indiana down offensively, then you start to wonder who can, especially in Bloomington, where Indiana's going to play 3 of its last 5 games. So that's probably why I would pinpoint Nebraska.
Well, I think that a sneaky candidate for this is Washington.
You're wrong.
You did not look at any of the stats for Washington, because they are actually statistically by far and away the best defense Indiana faces in the second half outside of Ohio State. Only allowing 125 passing yards per game. Has had 3 opponents to less than 10 yards.
10 yards?
To 10 points, sorry.
Less than 10 yards.
10 yards. That's how impressive. But also, what I'm interested about Washington is that they probably have the best quarterback that Indiana might face in the regular season all year.
That might be true. That I will agree with. It's either Rodgers or Howard at this point.
And I mean, and Rodgers obviously the most spirit. Rodgers' numbers. I mean, you want to talk about more Curtis Rourke than Curtis Rourke. 73% completion percentage, 1,600 yards, 12 touchdowns, 1 interceptions, one interception has been really, really good. His top target, Denzel Boston, 6'4". Really, the Indiana hasn't faced somebody like that, and I think their secondary has at times, they haven't needed to be great because they've rushed the passer so well. But D'Angelo Pons got run on a little bit at Maryland, against Maryland, and Washington might be sort of coming off the Nebraska game. If they win that, then they got the rivalry game the next week, kind of like a little bit of a trap there. And Washington, a team you wrote off after Big Ten Media Days. But in all seriousness, is a team that I think only had one returning starter from last year, so obviously had a significant rebuild like Indiana did. I think is an intriguing opponent just because when you're going against a quarterback that can change the game like that, I think it'll be a good test. Is how I would say.
Is Denzel Boston, and I'm finding conflicting. Is he David Boston's son? Are we getting to that age? I think he might be. I'm not positive about that.
It does not say that on his Wikipedia page, apparently.
It doesn't say it on his Washington page either. I found a couple places that that cited him as David's son, but I'm not going to go crazy deep into that. I will give you Washington to a point. I would push back on the idea of Will Rogers being more Curtis Rourke than Curtis Rourke. When they played the same number of games, Rourke is completing a higher percentage of his passes, has thrown for more yards and more touchdowns, and is averaging almost 2 more yards per attempt. Other than that, I will broadly agree with you that Rogers is probably the best quarterback. It's either Rogers or Will Howard, and Will Howard ultimately is partly going to be a function of the fact that he's got at least 2 NFL-level wide receivers to throw to. And I'm not taking anything away from him, but like when you're the quarterback at Ohio State, and Boston may well be an NFL caliber wide receiver too, but he's one. Ohio State's got at least one, probably 2, and I know one of them's a freshman, but man, he doesn't play like a freshman. So I still, though, I also think there is the intangible of if Indiana, what is the way to put this? If Indiana wins that Nebraska game, then I think suddenly the momentum grows again. Like it's almost like if Indiana started with these first 6 games, won these first 6 games, you get a groundswell of momentum. I think every win from here almost like kind of doubles what's already there, because Nebraska's sold out. If you sell out Nebraska, you're going to sell out Washington. That I would be shocked if that Michigan game's not a sellout. You may have some Michigan fans that make the trip down, but I'd be stunned if that's not a sellout. I also think we're looking at, I'm on record as, I'm on record as believing it's going to be a big noon kickoff weekend this weekend. But then you kind of cast your eye ahead a little bit. Washington could be a Saturday night game, NBC, possibly. I don't think they're going to play that game at noon with a team coming from the West Coast.
You don't think there's any chance the game
I really
day
don't.
picks that game?
I don't. You've asked me that question so many times that I wonder if you have a source at ESPN that has told you that they're going to pick it, and you're just getting ready to like do the Scooby-Doo reveal and just pull it off. Let's see who you really are.
Because they're looking for good stories, right?
No.
McAfee seems like he's in love with Curt Cignetti. He's obviously a big part of the show.
The other thing is you could save that game day trip for Michigan, because IU might still be at worst like 8-1 going into that Michigan game. You can bring game day to town for that one, or you can bring CBS to town for that one. One of the two.
Has game day been here?
Game day has been here one time, but it was for a Thursday night opener. So it was Thursday game day. It was like game day light. It was like
a season opener.
Yeah, it was Tom Allen's first game as head coach. They played Ohio State here. Game day was here. Whole set was here. Corso, Kirk Herbstreit, Reese Davis.
Do they have a guest picker?
I don't think so. No, because I don't think they
Alex
don't.
Graham in the Alex
Yeah,
Graham in
Alex,
the comments says game
long-
day with an asterisk, and I do
long-
agree. This sounds
long time listener, Alex Graham.
this sounds like game day light.
It's like game day zero. Is like what it's like. It was like diet game day basically.
Yeah. That was
again,
one of my other questions I had listed. Since you're an IU alum, I don't know if you broadcast that or not. Who would be your pick for guest picker?
Ooh, that's a good question. I've never thought about that. Me.
I that was your. I was gonna say that, not Zach Osterman, who is your guest picker.
Would John Mellencamp do it?
But is that right? Since he didn't go here.
Well, but he lives here.
But is the requirement? Isn't it?
No, the requirement is not. You went. Katy Perry did guest picker for Ole Miss once. Like, I mean, you don't. Unless I'm wrong, Katy Perry.
Well, I was looking at because I didn't know a lot about the alums here. There's some interesting ones. Lee Majors went to Indiana.
Did he? I honestly don't know.
Kevin Klein went to Indiana at some point.
Yeah, Kevin Klein went here. Mark Cuban. I feel like Cuban would be a pick,
but I mean, I feel like that's too obvious because I feel like sometimes
sometimes the college game day picker is obvious. Like sometimes that's kind of the point of college game day.
I would go unique. I would try something a little different. I mean, Cuban does say, Alex again chiming in with Cuban, and I do think that's sort of the obvious path. But Lee Majors,
Joe Buck would be the other one that I think, because Joe Buck is ESPN now, right? Because he's Monday Night Football. So I think, and he's been very vocal recently. A lot of stuff's been going viral of him talking about doing the, him talking about IU during the broadcast and things, and getting Troy Aikman on board. I feel like it might be Joe Buck, because the other thing is Buck would be good there in the sense that Buck would also know a lot about, at least enough about some of the other games he was picking. Obviously, he's on TV, so there's a level of sort of like comfort in that setting.
Also, Jonathan Banks went to Indiana. Breaking Bad.
Banks did go to Indiana. Yes, he did.
That'd be a fun one, don't you think?
I mean, yeah, I'm still leaning more toward.
You're leaning towards sports and not the sort of.
Well, but sports, but sports personalities. I mean, like Mark Cuban is a big personality in sports. His profile with IU athletics has risen pretty substantially in recent years. Joe Buck is a big personality within sports who now has a direct relationship with ESPN. My suspicion, if game day did come to Bloomington, I would probably go with Joe Buck. That would be my answer. After me, I would be number one, and then Joe Buck would be number two, basically. So we're really held in similar esteem in IU circles. People they often can't think of Joe Buck without also.
But do you think so? But do you think they go to?
It's at least the 33-minute mark of this podcast. So you have to. I said that's been true since at least the 33-minute mark of this podcast.
But, yeah, and I mean, I don't know if they do Mellencamp if they make him say no, just because he would be a big get, in terms of fan appeal,
Alex Graham says I want Chronic to do it and have the Bob Knight picture obscuring his face the whole time. That'd be pretty good. We're going to get Chronic back on the podcast. It's been a while. He's on vacation all week this week. We're not going to bother him while he's down at the beach. A hurricane might do it, but we're not going to. We obviously hope everyone that's been affected by these last couple hurricanes is doing okay. Talking about game day, talking about Curtis Rourke, talking about all this. I sort of posed this in our post-game podcast, but we obviously couldn't get too deep into it after Northwestern. Like, to what extent do you reframe the narrative around this team now, basically? Because on the one hand, yes, the toughest tests on their schedule remain. I think, there's maybe one team, maybe two, probably just one left on their schedule that is not demonstrably better than the six they've already played. Like, I understand why people are still at a national level, at a playoff level, at a Big Ten title level, saying, hey, we still need to see a little bit more to be sure. But on the other hand, it kind of goes without saying at this point, I think I had probably a more optimistic outlook than most people to Indiana's first 6 games, and I did not pick them to go 6-0. I certainly would not have expected them to look this good, this competent, this efficient, this ruthless, this, just sort of, just this good, frankly. When we sort of set aside or ball up and throw in the trash the old sort of conversation around Indiana, which was, can Indiana get to a bowl in Curt Cignetti's first season? Can they take advantage of the schedule? Can they keep Curt Cignetti's streak of 13 straight? Can they extend 13 straight, winning seasons to 14? Can they beat Purdue? Can they win their bowl game? All that. If we push all that to the side and acknowledge that Indiana's kind of graduated past a lot of that, like, to what extent do you reframe expectations around Indiana's season? What is a success? What is, I don't want to say a failure, because I don't think Indiana really can fail at this season at this point, other than like a total collapse, lose their last 7 games. But what is maybe, falls short of expectation, I guess, if we're bearing out like at least the minimum number, there's at least 7 games left in this season. Like, what do you expect from this team?
Well, I think anything less than probably 9 wins is a disappointment from where they're at now. And I think 10 wins and the Citrus Bowl is probably where I would guess that they end up. And anything above that, I think, would be just like an astounding sort of run for this team. Because I do think when you look at their schedule that they can only afford to probably lose 1 game.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
To make the playoff. From
a playoff perspective, yeah.
And that's going to be really hard, obviously. And that would probably include a win in the Big Ten title game. But I think double-digit wins, like you mentioned, first time ever in program history. Probably the most, the best bowl that is available to Big Ten teams beyond the playoff. And then, I think a bowl victory would do a lot for this team.
One of the things bowl right away now, because we've moved away from the New Year's Six, and all those New Year's Six bowls have gotten folded into like the quarterfinals, semifinals, like all the playoff stuff. The Citrus Bowl is the top of the line in the Big Ten if you don't make the playoff.
Yeah, and I wrote before the season, I think that you'll have a lot of buy-in for a bowl game here in terms of, players not opting out. A lot of those JMU guys sort of wanting to sort of give Curt Cignetti sort of like a signature win, not that they haven't had it yet, in terms of, success this season. But I do think that would be a meaningful sort of milestone for this team to sort of go out with a bowl game against a quality opponent in a quality bowl game, is sort of how I would look at it. I think, the longer you're in the playoff discussion, that's an amazing sort of accomplishment for this team, this program, these fans. But I do think that's a hard road just because of the schedule just isn't going to, we said that the schedule benefits Curt Cignetti in a lot of ways, but this isn't one of them.
Do you think if Indiana goes 11-1, and let's say they win, I don't want to say they win all of them super comfortably, but let's say that they keep winning with the same general sort of tenor of these first 6 games, like they beat Michigan by 10, they beat Nebraska by 14, they win on the road in a tough game at Michigan State, and they lose at Ohio State. And that loss to Ohio State because of the Big Ten tiebreakers. And I talked to on our good friend Jim Coyle's show this morning. Like, I tried going through the tiebreakers really quickly after Northwestern, and they're just so messy because the Big Ten's not split up at all anymore. Everybody's got to go into the same bucket, and then we've got to work out all the tiebreakers. But obviously, you're not playing a balanced schedule, so it's not going to be until like probably week 11 or week 12 that we really have a firm idea of if this happens, this team goes, and so forth. If Indiana wins with some style 5 of these last 6 games and loses a competitive game at Ohio State, but that loss at Ohio State precludes them because of the tiebreakers from the Big Ten title game. Do you think Indiana still makes the playoff?
Well, it depends how everybody else like. So then does Ohio State? Because Ohio State will have wins. Because it means Ohio State will have beaten Oregon, Penn State, Oregon or Penn State, and then one of those again. And then like it's the same for those team. If Penn State then wins the Big Ten, they have one win over Ohio State and one loss. Like, does Indiana have anything that stacks up their resume against those teams, those 3 teams?
Well, but Indiana doesn't necessarily Indiana can make the playoff with those 3 teams, though. I mean, that can happen. I think the question is probably more, and I know you've got to get out of here in a couple of minutes, but I think the question.
Do you think the Big Ten is getting 4 teams?
I think the question in that scenario probably comes down to more. How would the committee stack up a 9-3 SEC team against an 11-1 Big Ten team? If the 9-3 SEC team was like Ole Miss with some good wins, but 2 more losses against Indiana with some decent wins, Washington probably decent win, Nebraska, Michigan, but maybe not the signature win that an SEC team might get, even if they only go 9-3. Does that make sense?
I think a 2-win difference against an SEC team would probably go to the way of Indiana, but a 1-win difference wouldn't.
I agree with. I think I broadly agree with that. I also agree with probably your general assessment. I think 9 wins would be a successful season from here on. I think certainly getting to double digits. Indiana's literally never had a double-digit season in wins. I think that would be a landmark achievement. I think winning a bowl game, frankly, of any description at this point is just something Indiana needs to do to get that 30.
But to do it in the Citrus Bowl Citrus Bowl would be
well, even to do it in an Outback Bowl. It's called the ReliaQuest Bowl now. I'm not going to call it
the
that.
ReliaQuest Bowl does not sound as impressive.
No, even to do it in an Outback Bowl against a presumably impressive team. Both of those games, I think, are still SEC opponents. I know the Citrus is. Just to get that, I mean, it's kind of one of those where, we've talked about this before. If Indiana went 6-6 and then won its bowl game, just getting that streak off its back, and in the same way that Indiana went 20 years or 17 years or something as the last Power 5 team to in terms of, I think Indiana hadn't been ranked between 1993 and 2019, and they got ranked for 1 week in 2019 or 2 weeks because they beat Northwestern, then they had a bye week, then they lost at Penn State. But it was just getting that off their back so that every time that ESPN or whoever flashed the graphic up and Indiana wasn't the last team to, the team that's furthest from its national ranking anymore. Those are little things, but they add up when you don't have to answer for them anymore. I know you've got to go. I have
2 quick questions. All
right. And then we also have to acknowledge really quickly, Mark Hess, I'm not sure what vowel we're missing there. Antoine Randall, guest picker. I think that would be a bit of a dark horse, but I think Randall's working right now. I think he's on the NFL staff, so that could be tough. Is he with the Lions or maybe the Bucs?
Must not have bought.
What?
That was the Lions. But so do you playoff or no for you? Do you think?
I still think that's probably a bridge too far for this season. I don't think it's. I mean, if you'd said playoff or no, even after the UCLA game,
no, just but where they're at, you have to acknowledge just that they have a shot. Yeah,
I think that's probably still a little out of reach for this team, but I don't think it's impossible.
Yeah, I think we're in alignment. My last question: your prediction for the Purdue final score? Does Indiana over or under 77 points?
Under 77.
Under 77.
We've witnessed it. To think about what 77 requires. I mean, you kind of don't realize just how much you have to score to get to set. That's 11 touchdowns in 4 quarters. The one thing I will say is that rivalry game has a proud and sordid history of bad teams sneaking up on good ones. I don't think that would happen here, but I could see a world where Purdue's got enough fight in it to push back a little bit. I think more likely than not, you are looking at, Joe Tiller did this to Indiana a couple times. You're looking at a 52-7, kind of you're looking at a name your score kind of game. And who knows where anybody's going to be health wise at that point and all those different kinds of things. But if, for example, Indiana's 9-2 going into that game, and Purdue is just very clearly like trying to squeeze the last air out of the balloon so the season can end, that's when I think you're looking at maybe Indiana winning that by 35, 40, maybe even more points.
Curt Cignetti asks, "What's the most points we've ever scored in that game?" and shoots for one higher. That's my prediction.
Did you watch the rivalry game last night? The Coastal Carolina James Madison.
They named their score as well, right?
I took in. Okay, we're not going to read that one out loud on the podcast, Mark. I'm sorry. Thank you all for joining us. This has been fun. We'll do more of these. Again, I don't know that every one of our podcasts will be live, but we will try to do more of these and get people involved. We'd love for these to be more interactive now that we've moved over to StreamYard as a hosting platform. And obviously we will be back next week to more in-depth preview Nebraska and probably start talking about in more pointedly about our basketball expectations, because it is very much moving toward that season. We are today just 16 days away from the exhibition at Tennessee. But for now, for the Indianapolis Star and the Bloomington Herald Times, he's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great weekend, a bye weekend. We'll talk to you soon.